You had mentioned that you help people post prison get their lives together, their goals and things like that. How did that come about?
Let's just say that I was 53 years old. I had been through 8 different career changes. I had moved my family from one state to another, trying to find my best place where I fit or felt like I could do my best. And I never could find my place. And at one point, I was even homeless before I met my wife. So what happened was at 53, my wife and I decided that we've had all of these, what we call detours. Maybe we can help other people who have had their own detours and maybe are in desperate straits, more so than us. So we opened, with my construction background, I opened up a homeless shelter. And the idea was not just to offer shelter, but to offer some sort of mentoring. And that one thing led to another, and the Department of Corrections said, would you help us with men coming from prison who are homeless? They're low-risk offenders, but if they have housing that's stable, we feel that they could get a job and then get back on with their lives and complete the process of rehabilitation. In other words, we want them to be taxpayers instead of tax burdens. But the first step is a shelter. And so we started with that, and we did that by opening a nonprofit called Good Samaritan Home. And my wife and I did it all ourselves. But one thing led to another, and before you know it, we had a second house and then a third house. And in the past 23 years, we now have 19 houses and 10 staff, and we have helped in one way or another nearly 2,500 men and women restart their lives. So what I thought was a detour or a last-ditch effort turned out to be my life's work. So that to me is the lesson in itself, for me at least.
When did this transition happen in your life? Around how old were you?
I was 53. And, most people, we had no money saved. We had the only house we could afford at the time was the oldest and cheapest house that needed a boatload of work. And I promised my wife that we would have it done in 3 months. And 14 years later, I was still working on it.
Right.
So, but you can see part of it behind you here because it was completely remodeled in a Victorian style. And the idea was to create a warm, calming atmosphere. So that what I thought was a sidebar in construction turned out to be the best thing that ever happened because many of the houses we purchased needed a great deal of work. Mm-hmm. So I was able to remodel them, and because we couldn't afford to buy much, but we could certainly afford to use sweat equity. And it was a long process. It was not easy. There was no income for 5 years. But now we get what is called a per diem. The state will pay us a small amount because it's cheaper to pay a shelter for temporary housing than it is to put somebody in prison, because that can cost upwards of $90 or $100 a day per person. The attitude is if somebody is in the community working, they're paying taxes, they're paying child support, they are buying goods in the community, they're taking that step towards rehabilitation. And so everybody wins with that sort of philosophy.
I don't know too much about this, but have you seen incarceration rates go up, down, about the same?
Well, I don't track the specifics of it. The Department of Correction does, but generally 3 years is the baseline for measuring recidivism. And there has been, we were running upwards of 50% failure rate, not we, but the state. The recidivism rate, the return to prison rate was running 50%, and in other states it was running 60 and 70%. And that means that prisons and the post-prison work simply wasn't working. So the push now is to get people as soon as we can, once they serve their sentence, get them into the community, because that's where family is, that's where services are, that's where real life is. And we have found that with low-risk offenders, there is a much greater chance of success if they're in community. And so that's why our program is here, because it's in community. So we partner with the local offices like Job and Family, with mental health, recovery services. We don't do that, but we offer the housing component for them. And so together, we're able to work as a rehabilitation cooperative. And yes, the numbers are clear that recidivism has gone from, in Ohio, down from 50 down to, I believe it's in the neighborhood of 30%, which is a significant decline in that number.
right? Now, with people who are a part of this community, did you eventually shift into more of this coaching and goal setting and things like that with them, or how did that come about?
Well, I think what I've learned is that most people coming from prison, or actually most people in general, they just need to be heard. So what we can do is, if my staff and I just spend time listening to somebody with benign questions that are actually quite provocative. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father. And what I hear again and again is the father is often non-existent, and the mother may be struggling to support 2 and 3 and 4 kids on little or no income, or they may come from foster care and have no family background. So when you listen to somebody, what you're showing them is that they're important. You're showing respect. And respect, I believe, is the key to the first part of rehabilitation. And in fact, we even teach that in little ways in our house. If you make your bed in the morning, you show respect for yourself and you show respect for your roommate. And it's what I call a pronoun shift. You're going from I to we. And that, to me, is the primary rehabilitation step.
And I know I'm asking in generalizations here, but what do you think is a common reason of this inward drive of crime, right? You said you saw people with family dynamics and struggles, right? So clearly there is a pattern here of some sort of trauma or pain points from somebody's past that provokes them to do the actions they did.
I would say check on all of that.
Yeah.
But what has really changed things in the past several years, it used to be alcohol issues, but that was not a significant number. But now drugs drives much of what we're dealing with particularly low-level crimes, either using or selling or the drug-related crimes. So I would say pushing 80% of the people we deal with have addiction issues. Now, before that, you may have had mental health issues that underlie that, or you may have had all these family structure issues. So I would say if you're looking for a simple answer, you won't find it. But if you're looking for a multitude of areas that all come together to create this vast dysfunction we call prison, I would say that alcohol addiction, drug addiction, family structure, abuse, sexual abuse in the families. Regarding sexual abuse, we've found that people who have been abused tend to abuse later because that becomes their normal. And it doesn't make what they've done any less offensive, but it certainly makes it understandable. And so we try to deal with everybody on that level. We don't ask where you've been. We only ask, how can we help you today? And your offense, by the time you reach us, is not an issue because we're not punitive. We're not here for punishment. We're here solely to help you help yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that question kind of arose because you were talking about this idea of being respected and heard, right? And how just about everyone, regardless of prison or not, right? Everybody wants to be heard and respected. So I was curious to think maybe if you boil it back down enough, right? Maybe that there's some commonality there because drugs and alcohol, to me, it seems like are just byproducts of coping mechanisms, or for whatever reason they couldn't handle or know how to handle whatever they went through. So it's a quick course of action. What is your thoughts?
Maybe I can give you an anecdote on that. My wife went to Walmart on Black Friday morning early. It must have been 6, 7 o'clock because she gets up very early. And what she saw was hundreds and hundreds of people in there looking for the Black Friday deals. And they looked like they had just gotten out of bed. They had thrown on a coat over their pajamas. They had babies sitting in the carts. They were running around trying to buy things. And the common denominator was, she said, they all looked like they couldn't afford to be there. But we are so infatuated with this idea of sales on even the term Black Friday says volumes. But the idea that people who are buying things for this Christmas. And the reports I'm getting is that many people in America still owe money on last Christmas. So you have this family dynamic that says, I want to buy and do all these things, but basic things like even getting dressed to go to the store, which you and I would assume is a normal thing for a parent, it's not among the poor class. And I would say that we're dealing with poverty issues and poverty thinking. And out of that comes, what do I have to do to survive? Or better yet, what can I do today to make me happy? And happy might be buying this or taking that or doing that to you because you have something I want. I would say I'd even go so far as it may even be a spiritual issue where we're looking for some degree of stability and structure in our, not just our lives, but in our community. But if we are always looking at television for our community or looking at our phone now to Facebook and trying to find a community with strangers, and they may or may not be the people they say they be. I get texts all the time from somebody says, hi, I'd like to be your friend. And she looks to be 20 years old, a hard body. And my guess is she's probably a Russian guy with a mustache. And what he's really looking at is my wallet.
Yeah.
So, but there are people who do buy into that. And a lonely person will find ways to be unlonely. And unfortunately, they're often dangerous ways. We live in a society, I believe, that has disintegrated in many ways, and drugs may be the self-medication to address that. So I don't deal with the macro issues because I'm not able to do that. But what I do deal with is the micro issues. How can I help you today? So maybe if I help one man get a job, maybe I've made his life a little more stable, and maybe his world will be a little safer. So that's my goal. I shoot low.
Yeah, makes sense. I am a little curious, though. You mentioned earlier even the idea of Black Friday speaks volumes. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, we live in a consumer culture. Obviously, everything around us says, if you buy this, then you will be happier. When I was growing up, the cars every fall in September, they would run to the showroom with the new models for the coming year. And the newspapers and magazines were filled with the new models. And the beautiful women were showcasing these new cars with the chrome and the fins. And even though you bought a car last year and you paid at the time, say $3,000 for it, and it was a great car, and you used it 10,000 miles, in September, everything on television told you that you needed to now get the newest model to be happier, and your neighbors would respect you more if you had this extra chrome piece. And so I grew up thinking that if I just had the bigger, nicer car, when I was growing up, it was the muscle cars. And I used to lay awake at night thinking if I just had a GTO, then I'd get all the girls. So I found that there were some who are attracted to the GTOs, but they're not the ones you marry.
Yeah. I also realized things that you think will attract women is actually what men find more attractive, like cars, getting very fit in the gym, expensive watches. Because I think past a certain point, the average woman maybe doesn't even care or doesn't know, but we know all the little details like, oh, this is carbon fiber here, this and that. I think it's just a very funny little thing that I noticed.
Interesting you bring that up because the reports I'm getting lately, particularly in the light of the election results, where it was the young men, what I call the Facebook age group, the ones who watch the reels on Facebook, and because most of the reels are always about bullies picking on somebody and you fighting back and defending your whole group and it's often high school or junior high type of videos. But we're finding that the politicians, the Republicans in particular, appealed to that. And they showed Mr. Trump as being the manly man who could help you fight back against injustice. And there was a large swing of young men who went towards this conservative Republican voice. And whether you agree or not, I think it's just a fact of political dynamics. And he found what was the need in the community, and he appealed to it, and they bought it. But my granddaughter told me something very interesting. She's in college, a freshman, and she said that she finds that most boys, she doesn't want to date them because they seem disconnected. They seem to want to spend their time on their phones instead of talking about their futures, or even at a relationship. It's internal instead of external. And she finds that there aren't many boys that she wants to date because of it. So I think there's a lot going on in our culture right now. And it certainly is not the degree that I deal with, but I think it's in the same breeding ground.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised. And if, the book Homo Sapiens, the author talks about multiple different revolutions that we've had as a human race, and the last one being the Industrial Revolution. And then now, supposedly, we're in this technological revolution, right? So it makes a lot of sense that with every big change that we saw in our history, there was a lot of also unfortunate byproducts that we had to learn and come across. Like, for example, when we shifted to agriculture and we started settling down, we had more back pains and hip pains that developed because we were more sedentary, right? So,
Absolutely.
right. So I do see this being something that this is our generations and the next several generations are to overcome and learn, because there needs to be this balance with technology. I saw a post on social media that said the 90s and early 2000s was the best time for tech because it was the perfect balance between technology and society, because we all had home computers and home phones, but not all of us had these astronomical devices in our pocket or glasses or any, the crazy wearables we have today.
And we have to have them, or else we're not as sophisticated as we want to be. I find myself, I'll wake up at 3 a.m, and first thing I do, because I'm laying there, I say, well, I'm awake, let me check my mail. And then I'll slip into New York Times and read an article. And before you know it, it's 3:30, 4 o'clock. And instead of engaging with people during the day or sleeping at night, we turn to our devices. And I think the unintended consequence of that, we haven't seen the ultimate result of that yet.
I think we're starting to. I have some friends that even went the route as a high school teacher. And what I find really interesting is my friend was telling me that the kids today already in high school seem very disconnected. Even compared to 10, 15 years ago, high school seemed very different. People had to communicate more because you couldn't just immediately jump onto your phone, put on some headphones and, disconnect from everybody. Yeah, I just don't really know how you would able to push that at a macro level. I think we could only educate people and maybe have that small shift.
I think what happens is maybe it's the same dynamics going on. We're just doing it on a broader scale. We're still tribal in that we're finding our like-minded persons on the net, and we try to stay with those groups, and we only feed back. For example, if you are progressive, you'll stay with CNN and MSNBC. If you're conservative, you'll stay with Fox and Newsmax and such, and you only get that news. But what I try to do is I try to find a balance so at least I can see what one side is saying and the other is responding. But I'm not sure that most of us do that because we've polarized so much that instead of talking with you, we yell at you. And we're not debating, we're threatening one another. But I have to be fair. I'm not opposed to the technology because I live by it. I work on it. I couldn't have written my book without the technology, and I couldn't have published it through the Don Quixote Press without the technology. And I couldn't communicate with you right now without the technology. And I've done dozens of these podcasts, and I've talked with people that I would never meet. So I think of technology as like a Mustang. It's a wild horse. But rather than shoot the horse, I'd like to learn how to direct the horse. I want to tame it and direct it.
Right. I think, like you said, it is a tool that needs to be learned how to be used. I think the issue is it happens so quickly over the last several years that there is no education, there is no understanding behind it of this idea of balance. But I do find it interesting that you said we are still tribal, because that makes a lot of sense. I think at the end of the day, even those kids that are sucked into their phones are going somewhere where they feel like they are part of a tribe, which means, I mean, I'd say a good, maybe not the best way, but just off the top of my head, maybe this idea of putting their phones away in school might be a start towards reconnecting the community that they're in front of.
Not even a question. Not even a question. One of the things my daughter has to deal with mostly with her teenage daughters, my granddaughters, is this idea of controlling the phone, because the phone is like bringing a stranger into your room and into your bedroom for conversations at midnight that they're just not normal. You wouldn't have friends in the house at midnight. Why be on the phone? But if your friends are doing it, it's very, very hard. It's when I was growing up, television was introduced, and our parents struggled with how to control television. And we only had 3 channels.
Yeah, yeah. And it was in the living room.
Yeah, that's right. Every time you changed the channel, you had to literally stand up and walk across the room.
Yeah, yeah. You couldn't get away with late night watching with by yourself
And the
without
most
waking everybody up.
controversial show was Ed Sullivan's Variety Hour,
Wow.
and black and white.
Yeah. Times have changed, and they're moving so quick that I feel that people need help and answers and just knowledge to help. Like you said, with the people you help that get out of prison, is your whole thing is to help them help themselves, right? And I think people need that knowledge of what's really happening here, because I was thinking about it the other day, and these marketing companies for these big companies, or the marketing departments for these big companies, have a big budget, and they definitely research human nature, human psychology, and try to learn what gets people interested. And I would go as far to say even some of these big names and influencers and people, celebrities, some of them even have learned that as well, how to be seen and not heard, right? What gets the most views, what's very maybe rambunctious enough to get people to listen. And I think if you could understand that some things are just plain marketing, or plain just selling and ads, like you said, the idea with Keeping Up with the Joneses, you said if you get that next car, you'll feel better. I think if we all are able to start to learn that, I think it'd be easier.
Well, let me ask you this, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Our economy, our American economy, if not the world economy, is based on one thing: consuming, buying. Everything is about buying. So if I don't buy, then somebody can't sell it, and then he can't employ his 500 or 1,000 workers. So as long as we keep buying, everything keeps moving. It's almost like musical chairs. As long as the music's playing and we're all marching around, we're fine. But the minute the music stops, somebody loses a chair. The economic disruptions are when we lose that chair. It's, I think, philosophically, spiritually, I'm very nervous with a consumer society, because of the lesson it teaches is, if you buy this, if you go to this place, if you do this, you will be happy. And without a stable underpinning of family, of faith, of even education, where you can look inward and say, I understand this issue. Without those, then you make decisions, I believe, based on consuming. And consuming it's a very vacuous response. And
Yeah.
I'm subject to it. I have to fight that all the time when I say, well, maybe I can just, let's go out and buy this. Let's do this. And because it's very easy to do.
Yeah.
I was
think,
thinking of Gaza. Right now, all they're worried about is survival. A place to get out of the weather at night, and hopefully they won't be bombed. And Ukraine has been facing this for several years. And so when I go into Walmart, I think of Ukraine, and I think, do I really need this? But it's very, very hard to fully understand what they're going through. But maybe we need to remind ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's where the empowerment of knowledge comes in, because to your analogy with the musical chairs, I think we forget that if we collectively just looked at each other and said, I'm not playing this game anymore, the person controlling the music has nothing to do, right? So, and I think in that similar analogy is our voices through our what we consume, whether it's content or just actual items with our money. Like, for example, I think slowly the health sector and industry in our country is changing. I think people, just like any other field, it's driven by money. There's a lot of money to be made in hospitals and pharmaceutical drugs and all these things. But from multiple people I've spoken to, whether it was on the show or just out and about, seems to be this common narrative of it's not doing what I really need it to do in terms of inner, deeper fulfillment. So I think it'll come a point where even throwing money at the problem, this isn't the solution. And once I think people realize that and seek alternatives, as a group, we collectively agree that, these pharmaceutical antidepressants aren't working, and maybe things like meditation works better, right? So I think as we grow, the market grows with us because they're like, well, the people aren't listening. They aren't buying these antidepressants anymore like they were used to, right? Things like that.
I wonder, though, if maybe some factors involved might be that there's been a decline in community events where we do things together. Even something so simple as going to church. The church attendance is down nationwide about 20% in this past few years. And part of that's post-COVID, but part of it is that people have just not bothered. And the end result, if you went there for political reasons or just community reasons or faith reasons, it's the idea of meeting with people. And there was a book written called Bowling Alone. And the idea was that we used to in the feast, our parent generation came out of the war and out of the depression, and they did everything in community because they so loved what they had gone through. And now they had the freedom to meet with the Kiwanis and the Rotary and the VFW. And they met in clubs and in churches. And they would come together regularly. And bowling was very popular then. You'd find bowling alleys all over town, and there were leagues playing every night. But now you don't see that because we do everything with the television or with the internet. And so he called it bowling alone. We're doing all our entertainment internally. And the end result is, I think, all this self-medication comes out of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a difference between being alone and being lonely.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being alone. I actually think it's quite empowering if you can learn to just sit and be and enjoy your own presence. I think it's that we have all these vices and phones and things that we can escape to instantaneously that the younger generations just weren't taught how important it is to just sit there and be alone. And ironically, I think that actually might even help with loneliness to some extent. Obviously, companionship and community still is important, but I think the real problem isn't even being alone. It's the loneliness aspect. It's not even putting down the phone for an hour to just sit with yourself. This all reminds me of as a kid, every time I'd see my grandpa, I was always amazed how he could just sit on his chair and just do nothing. And sometimes it'd just be hours. Sometimes he'd read the newspaper, sometimes he'd watch TV, but sometimes he'd just sit there in his chair, just relaxed, peaceful, calm. And as a kid, I want to play, I want to do this, I'm running around. I just still stuck to me to this day. I found it really amazing that someone was very content with just how they were.
There's a biblical passage says where the psalmist, the poet says, "Be still and know that I am God." And I think that's what you're saying. Just calm down and listen to nature. Listen to the sound of silence. Roll out the cacophony of sound. I like to compare it with, I enjoy country music, but country music today seems like most music. It's much more electronic. It's much more manipulated electronically. When I grew up under poets who would write songs that came from the angst of day-to-day living. Merle Haggard would be a good example, and Willie Nelson's another. You had storytellers who talked about human feelings, and you could identify with Loretta Lynn when she talked about her struggles as a young married girl growing up in poverty, or with infidelity with her husband. we could all identify, but we listened to her. She was actually talking with us in those songs. But I think today and I sound old when I say this, but music tends to be much more bombastic.
I agree.
I find that I don't connect with it like I used to, even though it may be it may be as technically quite good. I just don't feel the poetry of it. It doesn't calm me down. And in this day and age, with all the distractions, I want something to calm me down. And that's why when I get done with this conversation, I'm going to go. I'm going to go sit in a parking lot alone, let the sun beat down on me, and I'm not going to say a word to anybody. I'm just going to enjoy the quiet.
That's actually what I was doing yesterday. Now that you say that, yeah. What's funny is I grew up on more of this bombastic music, so a part of me has this childhood attachment to at least the past songs I listened to, right? But as time has progressed, I've also noticed, I don't know how strong this is of an influence, but it seems to be music has a strong influence on the human body and collective community, to the point where I think there might even be some subconscious programming based on whatever you're listening to. Whether you're just interested in the beat of a song, I think the lyrics also matter. And it's that heart and soul that you're talking about in music that I think sometimes is lost under what everybody thinks is the trend of what to talk about.
But let's take a comparison with classical music. When I didn't grow up with classical music, but I learned to appreciate it after college. And I was introduced to Beethoven and Dvorak's dances were incredible. I'd never heard anything where you had 70 musicians all playing together, and I felt my emotions going up and up and up, and then come gently down at the end. And he could lift me and walk me through one stanza after another for 40 minutes. And I found it to be like not just a walk, but even a roller coaster of emotions, where he took me through all these feelings. And at the end, I felt exhilarated and exhausted. And I thought, that to me is an experience. But when I was in college, we were listening to Mick Jagger singing, "Hey, you, get off of my cloud," and 3 minutes later, I wanted to turn it louder and louder to feel the music. But at the end, I felt like I'd been beaten up because it didn't connect. It just pounded on me. And I'm not critical of the Stones. I'm just saying that there's a different response to it. And I think that classical music, where you have all these musicians playing a part instead of one star doing the solo act, I think there's something for the community in music.
That's a very good point now that you say that, I think, because the way that music was composed was through a community.
Community, yeah.
Interesting. I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah, and you're playing a violin, and you're just one of 70, and there's nobody who's the star. In fact, the conductor is simply directing the people, and they're all stars, but they have one part. In fact, the guy at the end who does an 1812 overture, who does the cannon sound at the end, he's the star, and all he did was pop a cannon.
I think that's a very interesting idea about community through music and how that actually shows. But I guess even going a little bit backwards to what we were talking about right before this with loneliness, it also reminds me of what you said about how your granddaughter was talking about the guys her age being disconnected after COVID. It seems that only increased exponentially about this idea of loneliness and disconnectedness. So, I mean, what do you think would be the steps forward from there?
You and I can compare. We can look back and say, I remember when we did this. And it doesn't just show our age. It shows that we can compare to different options. But a kid who's 19 years old, he went through high school where they were shut down for upwards of a year or more. And that was devastating for so many teenagers. And we calculate they've lost at least a year of grade point learning. And that's fine for people who are motivated. They could do that on their own. But the average student, the average kid in high school, probably fell back at least 1 year. because they don't have the structure or the skill set. And we just don't know the long-term repercussions of that. And it used to be you could go into a factory after high school, just go to get a job at the factory, make a decent living. But the factories have shifted now where it's the Amazon factory and all you're doing is passing packages and you're temporary. And it's not like you're working at the General Motors and you have a 30-year lifespan there. So we've become a service economy. And I believe that boys are saying, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And they all can't be video programmers, even though they think they might.
Right. Well, John, I was going to ask you, as you know, the show is called Learn or Be Learned. So I love to ask my guests this closing question, which is, what is one life lesson that you would like to leave the audience with from your life?
Actually, I hadn't intended to go this direction at all with this conversation. That's why I never know what's going to happen on these podcasts. But I would say that every podcast I'm on, it always comes down to what I consider to be my life philosophy, is that life is written in pencil. You make a lot of mistakes, but you can start over. You do get second chances. And all the things we've talked about, the detours that I've taken or that you may have taken or the kids we're talking about, there's a tendency with the internet to think that your mistakes are forever in ink on the internet. And you can never overcome what you did in high school, or in our case, what got you to prison. But the truth is that you can. Our legal system, our moral system, our societal system is about second chances. And I just want to remind people, don't quit running. Always, always try again. And I guarantee you, there's a back door. You can make it if you keep running.
Yeah, it's almost like the only way to lose is to quit.
Yes, that's very good. Very good. I've fallen down so many times, and I'm always, always starting over. It took us 7 years to get through the legal challenges when we started Good Samaritan Home, but we never, never quit trying. And today, 2,500 men are here because of that. And if we had quit, maybe they wouldn't be here.
Yeah. I mean, imagine the ripple effect of each one of those people have now on the people around them, their community, right? So you really can make a big impact as long as you keep going.
Now we're talking about It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. Probably the best movie ever made.
Right.
Your life impacts many others that you don't know. That's right.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for being here on the show.
My pleasure. I had no idea how we went in areas that I've never gone before, but I learned some things today. Thank you.
Thank you. Me too.